You probably all know the name Amy Johnson, and you may have read something about her. She was a pioneering aviatrix who featured in newspapers and plenty of stories about her through the years. But something that's not reported on is her time in Western Australia. There was a few days, 3 or 4 days in Western Australia, and I'll tell you about that. But first of all, I'll give you a bit of background on her, just for those who don't know much about her. But she was born in Kingston in 1903, which was a suburb of Hull. She came from a well-off family. Her father was an executive in a fishing company. They had no trouble in buying and living the way they wanted to. She graduated from university with a Bachelor of Economics. She was attracted by the bright lights and went to London, where she worked for a solicitor. While she was in London, she was attracted to the London Aeroplane Club, and she got her pilot's licence, private, the equivalent of a private licence. She wasn't a born aviator. She hadn't gone solo by 16 hours, and the advice to her at that stage was, since you haven't gone solo in 16 hours, you don't have the hand for this sort of thing, and maybe you should give it away. But she persevered. She then went on at the London Aeroplane Club and became an apprentice engineer, and she was the first woman in England to gain a C licence, an engineer's C licence. You can only think that in doing that she probably had an ulterior motive in mind, that she could service her aircraft while she went off and broke a few records, because that seemed to be what her life was made up of for the next 5 or more years. So she spent time working for the London Aeroplane Club, not using her BA. Then, with the help of her father, and by talking to Lord Wakefield of the Castor Oil Company, $500 from her father, she had enough money to buy a Moth aircraft, and that's her with the Moth aircraft. And so in that aircraft she became the first woman to fly from England to Australia to pilot an aircraft. She left Croydon with 75 hours in a logbook. When we think back to what our experience was like at 75 hours, I wouldn't want to take on an international trip. So she really was a pioneer aviator. That was the route that she took, and for the first couple of days she compared her progress with Bert Hinkler, who'd been in the air 2 years before in 1928, and established the record, inaugural record for the first flight of a single-engine aeroplane from England to Australia. She soon fell behind the timing of Hinkler because she had a few mechanical problems. Next, there was dust, which she couldn't overcome. Then she had a couple of minor accidents, very minor, which she could repair. There was the bureaucracy, the brick wall of the bureaucracy in the Middle East, which held her up. And so she left Croydon on May the 5th and arrived in Darwin on May the 24th. 11,000 miles in 20 days, and Hinkler's record was 15 days. This had her stamped as a pioneering, or aviatrix, as she was called in those days. She must have been an inspiring figure, because the newspapers around the world, and particularly in the English-speaking world, were full of reports on what she'd been up to and what she'd done. In Darwin, she was welcomed by thousands, and when I say thousands, I'm not just making these numbers up. Multiple thousands of people would front up to see her. Remember, back to those days, there was no TV, and people who were interested items would actually go and see the person. And you'll see more of this as time goes on. But a lot of them wanted to touch her. Some of the men wanted to kiss her. And one of them got a real smack in the face in Hay Street in Perth. And rightly so. She received telegrams from King George V and Queen Mary. She received a telegram from the King of Belgium and the British Prime Minister, and Louis Blériot congratulating her, and the Australian politicians were in on it as well. She was invited along to luncheons and dinners wherever she went, and it became a very busy life for her. She then flew into Brisbane, and it was a long, arduous journey after she'd worn herself out on the flight from England to Darwin. And while in Darwin, she was created a CBE, Commander of the British Empire. Unfortunately, she crashed her aircraft as she arrived in Brisbane. We can put it down to sheer exhaustion, maybe. But she landed the aircraft and ran into a fence and damaged the aircraft rather badly, and it never flew again. It was a wooden constructed moth, and the pieces of wood didn't really go back together again too well. So it's been reconstructed and it's in a museum in London if you ever wish to see it. And so there's a dotted line between Brisbane and Sydney where she was transported in another aircraft. And it was in Sydney that her sponsors, de Havilland and Castrol Oil, got together and said, we will visit the eastern capitals. And that was Sydney, Canberra, Melbourne and Adelaide. And that dropped Western Australia off the list. As time went on, they thought things were going so well and she was attracting so much attention and the sponsors were getting so much mileage out of it, they thought that they'd better include Western Australia. So over she came. At Forest, she was a guest of West Australian Airways and Norman Brearley, and then she flew on to Kalgoorlie. She lost a day because of bad weather and headwinds. While she was in Kalgoorlie, she was welcomed by all and sundry. There are the Shire councillors and road board members with her. There she was underground with the Perseverance Mine staff, or some of them. The Women's Council invited her out for a meal or a luncheon or something. She also went to the Kalgoorlie Memorial, War Memorial. She left Kalgoorlie early in the morning expecting headwinds, and they weren't there. So she was running well ahead of time. So she dropped into Tamman on the following day between Kalgoorlie and Maylands. And so she left early. But it turned out that the wind wasn't as bad as she expected. She was running ahead of time. And it's a shame that Trevor Sweeting's not here, because he told us about the Tamman farm a few meetings ago, where his grandfather had welcomed Charles Kingsford Smith. So Amy Johnson landed at Tamman to waste a bit of time before arriving at Maylands. So that's a photo of her being driven around Tamman and outside the post office. That's her arrival at Maylands. The arrow points to the Aero Club building. The aircraft there is the Hawk Moth, which was flown by Herod de Havilland. De Havilland were getting as much advertising out of it as they could. This is the welcoming committee forming a V to lead her into the Aero Club. And of course there's the DH-66 Hercules there. And at the time the Aero Club had 2 aircraft, 2 Moths. There's the aircraft that she flew in, and there were speeches. There had to be speeches in those days. And so in pecking order, we had the Governor, the Premier and the Lord Mayor, and then the President of the Aero Club, Mr. James Dimon. Later she was driven to the Savoy Hotel for a bit of a freshen up, and that's her arrival in Hay Street to the Savoy Hotel. The crowd was a little upset because they assumed that she would approach the Savoy Hotel via Beaufort Street and the Beaufort Street Bridge. But for some reason they changed their tune and came down William Street over the Horseshoe Bridge and then along the terrace. And so there was up to 5,000 to 6,000 people rushing around the city to try and get near her. You can see in the centre of that there are the police and the car that she is there. They formed what they called a ring-a-rosy, and eventually it was 10 policemen who were locked in a circle arm to arm with her in the middle, and the police ring-a-rosy moved towards the door of the hotel where she entered and then came out on the balcony and waved to them and then went back inside again. So all those people had to go home. But at least they'd been there and they'd seen her and someone touched her. After waving to the crowd, freshening up, she went back to Maylands where she was welcomed again by the president, the forerunner of this club, and more speeches were made, and there was a crazy flying display put on by one of the breweries. So Norman's brother put on a crazy flying display, and it was a carnival atmosphere. It had been announced that she was going to fly into Subiaco aerodrome, but the weather wasn't very good, so that was knocked on the head, and she went to Subiaco by car. There was a huge crowd at Subi, University Playing Grounds, what are they called? Anyway, McGilvray Oval, yeah, that's what it became, and it was very difficult to get to in those days. They had to walk quite a distance from Subiaco to get there. So there's more people expecting an aircraft to arrive, and she arrived by car. In the evening, she was invited to a function at His Majesty's Theatre, and this was an evening organised by the women's councils or organisations of Perth. They were the ones who were behind getting her to say a few words. She was not a good speaker, but she'd learned a bit by the stage and had been improving her performance as time went on. On Sunday morning, she was taken for a drive through the main streets of Perth. She laid a wreath at War Memorial in Kings Park. She had lunch at Government House. This is a pretty tight schedule, isn't it? Every few hours she was going somewhere else. And then after lunch she went for a river cruise put on by the Royal Perth Yacht Club. Then on that evening she went to a concert at the Ambassador's Theatre. And so, totally exhausted, on Monday she had the morning off. She then went to lunch with government officials at the Palace Hotel and then off to Fremantle for her departure. She arrived at Fremantle to a rather large crowd, to a reception and more speeches by officials, and mid-afternoon she boarded the ship, the Naldera. There was a delay in the departure of the ship because they were unsure as to when she was going to be able to make it to Fremantle because there were so many interruptions to her schedule. But eventually it did sail at 8 o'clock at night and off she went. And that was the end of her visit to Western Australia. Most people don't know anything about that visit. They just may have read somewhere where she dropped into Perth and then departed on a ship. So there we are. When she got back to England, mid-1930, she went further into breaking records, and she married Jim Mollison, who was a famous aviator in those days, and either singly she broke records or together as a pair they broke records, even going back over routes that they'd flown and improving on the record that they had. They were divorced in 1938, and before World War II she turned her hand to modelling and fashion, which a lot of people don't know very much about. And then in 1940 she joined the Air Transport Auxiliary. This was a service provided by the English government. The people in it were those who had been refused by the Royal Air Force for one reason or another, maybe poor eyesight, poor hearing, and just other volunteers. So she was one of the volunteers, and their aim was to deliver aircraft which had just been manufactured, deliver them to the various squadrons, or aircraft that had been repaired would be taken from the repair factory to the squadrons where they'd be put back into use. However, one of her deliveries was in an airspeed Oxford on a very, very bad day. She shouldn't have been in the air, really. There was snow and sleet and so on, and she got lost. She was headed for an Air Force base to the left of London, or the Thames Estuary, and she ended up over the Thames Estuary. She ran out of fuel and parachuted out of the aircraft. She went into freezing water, and there was a small naval ship nearby. The commander of the ship dived over the side to try and rescue her, but he was affected by the water, cold water as well, and couldn't rescue her. And so he went back, was taken back to the ship, and he died 2 days later because of exposure to the cold. She was never found, and so her fate is an enduring mystery. No one really knows what happened. It wasn't the job of the English government in those days to tell people how their pilots, either in the Air Force or the ATA, had died, and so there was no coverage of how it might end. So there we are, the story of Amy Johnson. Thank you.